Welcome back to Beyond the Surface. I'm Quinton Mundell. Today we're diving into a critical and deeply personal topic, family support in addiction recovery. Addiction doesn't really happen in isolation. It really affects every relationship, especially the ones closest to the person struggling with addiction. I know personally, my brother battled his life of addiction, and it had a big impact on our family as a whole. At the end of the day, he actually passed away, and addiction was a struggle in his whole life. But it had a big impact on our whole family, our whole lives as well. As long as he struggled with addiction, we struggled as well. And it was so sad to see how addiction is affecting his brain, how it's affecting his behavior, and how his personality changed. That's my story of addiction. So I'm excited for this topic today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jean-Marie Olwage, and always, it's such a privilege to be here. This is our third episode together. And yes, Quinton, I think it's a subject that affects many of us, often personally. A lot of us have had someone that we know who's maybe been caught up in addiction or is still caught up in addiction. And sometimes it's something that families silently have to face and endure. Today, we're going to look at how families can maybe show up in more meaningful ways in the recovery process, because it's not something we're ever taught how to do, and how you don't burn yourself out in the process, lose yourself, and that you end up supporting the person caught up in addiction without enabling them.
Addiction has a big emotional weight on families. So when someone you love is caught in addiction, it's like watching them disappear in slow motion. Many times they lose their jobs, they lose their self-respect, they lose relationships, often marriages break down, and even the bond of their children is deeply affected. When you support someone struggling with addiction, fear, anger, and exhaustion are often part of the journey. Fear arises because you don't know what tomorrow will bring. Anger comes from broken trust and repeated disappointments, and exhaustion builds from the endless cycle of trying to help while feeling helpless. For a family member, that gets very overwhelming. And sometimes it feels like you're grieving someone who's actually still alive.
I think it's that having the using self and the non-using self, they can be very different from each other. And it's sometimes trying to understand who is that real person. And the person that you maybe knew, like you said, you end up grieving that person because there's different characteristics that pop up once they're caught up in addiction. And that can be such a lonely place to be, because many families don't talk about it. There's shame around it. They often sometimes think, what are they doing wrong? What did they do wrong? And they very often feel judged by the outside world. So that silence becomes dangerous. It's a place where they can sort of disappear, and it just reinforces the pain that they're experiencing.
I think we often hear the added story, but we don't actually ever hear the trauma the family is actually going through. This trauma has a big influence not only on the addict, but definitely on the family, because their whole nervous system are constantly on a high alert, because you never know what is coming next. The behavior of an addict is often unpredictable. This unpredictability comes from the constant pull of cravings, the need to protect the addiction, and the difficulty they face in taking responsibility. That's why manipulation and blame are so common, because admitting accountability feels unbearable while they are still trapped in the cycle of addiction. And this trauma now actually influence how the family members think, feel, behave. So it has an impact on them, on their self-image, on their self-esteem. They also experience shame for the family. Addiction often carries a stigma, and families may feel judged or blamed by others, as if the addiction is a reflection of their failures. This shame weighs heavily, creating isolation and silence. On a mental and emotional level, the impact is intense. Families live with constant anxiety, worry, and emotional exhaustion. Their sense of stability, trust, and even self-worth can be shaken by the chaos addiction brings into their lives.
And they can feel like they're on an emotional roller coaster. So the times the addict goes into recovery, it's a time of hope and things are changing around, going well. And then moments of relapse again, that the family feels, well, we're starting back at point zero again. And I think they often feel that they're stuck between this place of hope and heartbreak, trying to manage the chaos that comes with addiction while still trying to keep their own lives and families together.
Yeah. And the role of the family is so important in recovery for the addict. So the addict really needs the family in order to help with his or her recovery. So supportive relationships is actually the cornerstone of recovery. But most people don't even know how to support themselves. And many times people don't even know how to support without enabling. And it's not actually their fault. They just haven't been taught.
And understandably, that's probably where the lines start getting a bit blurry of where do you put up those healthy boundaries? Are you actually helping? Or are you maybe rescuing the person? I always say that support is not about preventing pain and keeping the consequences away from the person in addiction. It's about walking alongside someone through it. Because there's only two things that really change behavior, and that's reward or consequences. And often a really good meaning spouse or family member could think they're helping, but they're actually shielding the addict from the consequences. And they need to experience those consequences in order to successfully recover.
It's really hard to watch someone spiraling out of control, caught in that cycle of addiction. The deeper they sink into it, the harder it becomes for them to see any light or way out. Many addicts also struggle with intrusive thoughts, sometimes even thoughts of suicide. They often fall into a deep sense of depression. And because addiction affects the brain's chemistry, it can also trigger or worsen mental health conditions like bipolar disorder. It's incredibly painful to witness someone you care about losing themselves more and more, unable to take control or accountability for their life. I remember my mom, she said it's so hard for a mother's heart to actually see that and to experience it, that she could actually feel that pain in her own heart. And my dad always tried to do everything to help, but it often felt like no matter what he did or how far he went to support my brother, nothing seemed to change. My brother was so caught up in his addiction that nothing from the outside could really reach him. About 3 years before my brother passed away, things did shift. He went to Noordpoort for 2 years, and for a while he managed to turn things around. But even then, it was still such a struggle because he hadn't really learned how to face and process his emotions. Drugs had been his way of numbing the pain, and when that was taken away, he didn't have the tools to cope with life in a healthy way. It's almost as if people in addiction get stuck emotionally because they use substances to cope. They miss out on developing the skills we all need: how to manage emotions, how to handle stress, and face life's challenges. Research even shows that addiction impacts the brain's ability to regulate emotions and make clear decisions. So when drugs are gone, the person can feel as though they are still stuck at the same emotional level they were when they first started using. That's why recovery isn't just about stopping the drugs. It's about building emotional intelligence, learning how to feel, how to process, and how to live without needing to numb. Supporting an addict can be a real struggle, but I think healthy support means also respecting their autonomy, even when it hurts. And you need to realize I can only do this much, and I need to respect their journey and their choices, even though it is destructive.
think it's so hard for parents not to step in and want to shield their child, because as a parent, that's what you instinctively want to do. You want to protect your child from everything in the world. And then recovery comes with having to apply tough love. And
Mm.
that can be hard sometimes for a parent to do. But it's also about respecting your own needs through this, because the family members who aren't caught up in addiction matter as well. And the more that they can look after themselves, the better support they can be to the person who is stuck in addiction. The family support doesn't mean becoming a martyr yourself. It doesn't mean losing your own life as well in the process.
So let's get practical. What does support look like? I think education is key in order to support. It's difficult to support the addict if I'm uneducated. So therefore, I think families need to understand that addiction is a disease. It's not a moral failure. And addiction, like I've mentioned before, it has an impact on the addict's brain chemistry, how they think, how they behave, automatically has an impact then on the family as well. What do you think, then, John Marie?
I think you're right. I think it's difficult to understand as well what addiction is like if you haven't been caught up in it yourself. Often people will say, "Why don't you just stop?" And it's just not that easy. And I think that's where the education, as you mentioned, is so key. Educating yourself about what is actually addiction. Why is it not just a matter of just stop, just don't do it? I think the education also helps you then take things less personally, understanding how that addiction functions and that it isn't something that's in your control as a family member. And then secondly, boundaries is just so important. So helping someone doesn't mean absorbing the consequences. It's really saying to them, I love you, but I'm not going to participate in your self-destruction.
Yeah, it's difficult. The words "I love you" can many times get turned around by the addict as well. Like, if you don't do what I want you to do, then they say, "Oh, you don't love me," And many times that I've also seen with addiction, they usually battle finances. Now they want to steal stuff by you and they never have money. They manipulate you in order to get some more money, to get what they want, so they can actually do some more drugs. So yeah, sometimes in the family system, to support the addict, the "I love you" is actually no. And it can feel cruel, but actually it's the no is actually an act of respect. And by saying no, you actually saying, I believe that you can take responsibility of your own reality. So it's like putting back the power in their hands and to realize that their choice has a consequence. Because actually, what they're saying is they don't want to take accountability for their consequence and for their part in it. So now everything becomes yours. And that can become overwhelming for family members. The addict often avoids taking accountability. They don't want to face the consequences of their actions or the part in the struggle. And when that happens, the weight shifts onto the family. Suddenly, everything becomes yours to carry, and that burden can feel overwhelming.
It's kind of knowing where your responsibility lies and where the addict's responsibility lies, if I understand you correctly.
Mm, very true.
I think that's important also to mention that your boundaries then also need to be consistent. You can't move them around. You can't today, it's okay, and tomorrow, it's not okay. People need to know clearly where your boundaries are. And that doesn't mean being rigid and not being adaptable. It's just deciding what your non negotiables are. Where am I not going to move my boundaries? Because it's important. And it's about being predictable because your stability can really be an anchor to the person who's battling addiction. So let's talk about communication, which is such a vital part of the whole recovery process. When do you speak to the person and how do you speak to the person? So, if someone's high or intoxicated, it doesn't help to engage in serious conversations. It's not going to usually go well, especially if you're both in fight and flight mode. You really need to wait for moments where you're both more grounded, and there's moments of clarity. And it's important then to speak from a calm place, not from crisis or from emotions.
Yeah, very true. I think of couples or even people in everyday conversations, how often we get triggered. Many times, even in normal relationships, we battle to stay calm, to remain present, and to ground ourselves. And if it's already difficult in ordinary situations, you can imagine how overwhelming it becomes when addiction is part of the picture. And I think it's even more difficult to stay grounded in the moment with an addict because their behavior can be triggering. The things they do don't just upset us, they can really hurt us. And because
The
addicts, they really trigger us. And the things they do can trigger us and can harm us. So I think our natural survival instinct kicks in, that sense of fight and flight. But we need to realize you can't fix it in that moment. This is a much longer, more complicated process. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is, I'm here when you're ready. If they can come to you instead of you going to them the whole time, then you maybe have a better chance of actually solving something.
It's difficult when you're emotional not to want to jump in there and sort it out straight away and say, no, but this is what I want to do. To take that step back and go, I'm first going to go get grounded myself before approaching this. And maybe another technique to use is also to use I statements. Something like, I feel scared when I see you like this. I love you and I'm not okay with watching this happen. That can feel far less confrontational sometimes to the other person than using statements like, you did this, you always like this. You're using those phrases also always and never. Things are seldom, always, or never. It's being very particular as well. When you do X, Y, and Z, I feel this, this, and this. It gives that person much more clarity on where they actually need to focus than saying to that person, you're always never there for me. It's too broad.
I think person really needs to be wise, and the situations can teach you quite a lot of wisdom because it's so easy to go into a screaming match. And I think we need to remember that escalation doesn't actually serve either of you. It's okay to pause a conversation, and it's actually important to pause a conversation. You are allowed to walk away and come back grounded, because if you get out of control, the situation gets out of control, and then it just becomes more challenging. And now everyone say things they shouldn't say in that moment, which later leads to regret and just maybe has a bigger impact on you and on the addict as well. Now there's even more shame, there's even more guilt. And guilt always seeks punishment. Now you feel guilty, the addicts feel guilty, and there's a lot of punishment that many times activates also that inner critic within yourself and the inner critic within the addict as well. And now the addiction cycle becomes even more complicated. The family members play such an important and crucial role in the journey. If they can contain their own energy and keep themselves grounded, they can actually support the addict much more than if they're out of control.
Don't you sometimes find if you're screaming at someone and you're not getting a reaction out of them, there's far less satisfaction? You eventually start realizing you're the only person screaming. So you stop and take a step back. Just by one person sometimes being grounded and calm can de-escalate that whole situation than where you're both screaming at each other.
Otherwise, that screaming many times becomes a power struggle. Now people is like, war, who's going to win, And the fight is not about winning, it's actually about solving something. But yeah, when both people is screaming, there's no solving. It's actually more a power struggle than anything else. So let's take a look at self-care, because I think in the journey of supporting an addict, it's so important to take care of yourself. And I would say self-care is non-negotiable, because we all have resources in ourselves and you only have that amount of energy. And it's so easily a person can get depleted. So what suggestions do you have for self-care, John?
I think it's so important that you place yourself first on that list, and that can feel wrong. But very often we put ourselves right at the bottom of our priority list. And we forget that if we don't fill our own cup, we don't have anything else to give people around us. So, yes, that self care is so important. And one way to maybe fill that cup is to join support groups. Things like Al-Anon or Nar-Anon, or even an online community can really be a lifeline to somebody who's trying to navigate supporting someone in addiction, especially because the shame and the guilt sometimes keeps them from reaching out. It's a place where other people are experiencing something similar and where they maybe feel there's a safer space for them to share, where they don't feel so alone in this. Doing things that you enjoy, just taking care of your own passions and your own interests in life, not losing your own identity.
I totally agree because, like you've said, you can't pour from an empty cup. You need to fill your own cup because you can't give what you do not have. I personally think therapy is a great tool, not just for them, but for you as well, because we all have our own story, we all have our own wounds, and we all are on a healing journey, and we all deserve healing. And sometimes the more we heal, the more we can help the addict to heal. It's difficult to help someone else to heal if we're not even willing to heal ourselves. We cannot actually, in fact, expect of someone else to heal if we're not even willing to heal ourselves. If everyone is on a healing journey, it's so much easier to support yourself and one another because there's less judgment and more compassion.
And I think therapy gives you such a great place to unpack with someone who is not emotionally involved in that situation. Often an addict will go to inpatient treatment and the family will actually say they're fearful when the addict's going to come home because they may be doing great while they're in the recovery program. But once they're back in their day to day life again, it's a different scenario. So if the whole family, as you say, have gone through their own healing process, the recovery of the addict just stands such a better chance. And I think that self care also is giving yourself permission to laugh again, to rest, to be able to feel joy. I think often loved ones feel guilty that they are still enjoying life while maybe an addict is really struggling in their process. And it's not a case of you're abandoning them, but you're still living your life. So that relapse is really part of recovery as well. And I think often family members will see it as a failure, but it's actually just a signal to see, okay, what is working and what isn't working. It's not a failure. It's not starting at point zero again. But often families see it as a set instead of a learning curve.
I think every relapse holds amazing information. I have this one person and they like were actually clean for quite a while. I think it was a year or two. And then they had a relapse. And then I realized that I don't really do not want to be an addict. And it just helped them to make that final shift they actually battled to make because they previously they believed actually I'm missing something else. But after that experience, it's like they learned the lesson completely. And I just realized, oh, this is really not the life I want for myself. And I can do better than this. So I think also many times a relapse can show us what is unresolved. It can also help us to show where support is maybe still missing or what patterns still needs to be addressed.
I find that addicts struggle to identify sometimes their triggers, especially in the beginning process of their recovery. So a relapse can be a good indication sometimes, as you say, of things that are missing, what thought patterns maybe are still not acting in their favor. So it's a time to step back and to really take a look at what's going on. So that recovery, as we've mentioned, is not a straight line. It can be really messy, it can be unpredictable, but that doesn't mean it's not still a really meaningful process.
Healing for me is not linear, it goes through ups and downs. And therefore, I would say that progress isn't perfection. So every step forward, doesn't matter how small, counts. And how healing looks for the family and how healing looks for the addict is maybe something different. So it's important to meet the addict where the addict is and not have a expectation of where you expect the addict to be, because your expectation is going to create for yourself disappointment and quite a lot of suffering. One of the biggest traps in both addiction and recovery is expectation. As a family member, you might expect your loved one to stop using after a certain treatment or to never relapse again. And when reality doesn't meet that expectation, it creates disappointment, frustration, and suffering. From the person struggling with addiction, it's the same. They often expect themselves to be perfect in recovery, to never stumble, to always move forward in a straight line. And when they can't live up to that expectation, they end up drowning in shame, self-judgment, and hopelessness. Expectation for both sides easily becomes a source of pain. That's why it's so important to replace expectation with openness, to see recovery as a process with its ups and downs, rather than a straight path to some ideal outcome. So let's get honest about what not to do as a family member. There are certain traps that are easy to fall into, and one of the biggest is emotional blackmail or manipulation. I've seen it so many times. A family member says to the addict, "If you really loved me, you'd stop." Or think about what you are doing to us. The intention might come from desperation, from wanting to help, but the impact is the opposite. What actually happens is that instead of inspiring change, it piles on guilt, and guilt quickly turns into shame, and shame is one of the strongest fuels for addiction. So rather than pulling someone closer to recovery, manipulation and guilt actually push them deeper into the cycle. That's why, as family, the work isn't to control or coerce, it's to create an environment of honesty, boundaries, and compassion without shame. The addict is already rebellious, has already rebellious nature. So many times that emotional blackmail can just activate that rebelliousness, in my opinion. And it just creates even more shame for the addict, which makes that hole of addiction just even deeper and more difficult for them to get out. Because now they feel even more like a disappointment, more like a failure, and it actually influences their self-belief in themselves.
Emotional blackmail is such a difficult one not to step into because we often want to control others. And we need to step back to a place where we realize the only thing that's in our control is ourselves. And I think another trap that we often step into is over functioning, trying to manage everything for them. So, doing things that they really should be doing for themselves. It can feel like you're being helpful, but it can be really disempowering to the person caught in addiction because they're not doing it for themselves. They're not learning the lesson for themselves. Somebody is coming to bail them out, essentially.
It's hard to see someone else learning the lesson. What I also see many people who have children or loved ones with addiction, they battle with guilt because many times they think maybe it was my fault. For example, a mom and a dad maybe got divorced and now the children was unable to cope with that situation. It was so traumatic. Then they went to addiction. So now that parents basically sit with that guilt. People always go and look for a reason. And many times, if they can't find the reason by the addict, they go and look for a reason within themselves. And therefore, they go to guilt. I think it's important for the family members to remember and to know that you didn't cause the addiction. And you can't control the cure for it either. You're not responsible for other people's choices. Life happens actually in essence to all of us, but we all need to make choices that's best for ourselves. We can't just make choices and then blame other people for our choices. Our choices is still our responsibility.
I think it's difficult for us to sometimes also realize that we can't save anyone. We can support them, we can be there for them, but we really are not in a position to save anyone. Only they can do it for themselves. So your job as a loved one is really to support them and not to jump in there and rescue them. You know, if the addict has had a car accident and phones you to quickly come and bail all the drugs out of their car, it's tough to turn around and say, I hear you, but I'm not going to go do that. It's drawing that line of, unfortunately, the consequences is something you're going to have to experience.
I think one of the most important things is to stay in touch with your own joy and your identity. Because the family, as a family member, you can get so swept up into this drama, and this becomes your only focus, and you can actually get obsessed with this. So this crisis can start later to rule your life. So I think it's important to remember that you are a whole person, and you need to remember your own creativity, your own passions. In your opinion, what would you say is necessary to stay in touch with your joy and your own identity, even going through this crisis as a family member?
I think it's trying to remember what your past passions were and what your past interests were and engaging in those again. Again, saying to yourself, it's okay for me to do something that I enjoy, like painting, dancing, going for a walk, reconnecting with nature. Writing is a wonderful tool. It really helps you also get a clear idea of your own thoughts and emotions surrounding things. And what's nice about writing is you can be 100% honest without fear of a comeback or what is someone going to think of this or am I going to hurt someone by saying this? So the writing is your safe space. It's reconnecting with really what lights you up in life again.
Yeah, I love writing myself. I found journaling is quite an amazing tool. It really helps with the process and to understand what I'm actually going through. For me, when something just stays in my head, it becomes like a loop. The same thought comes around again and again, and each time it does, it seems to pick up more weight, almost like it grows a tail. And before I know it, I'm stuck in overthinking. I'm making assumptions. I'm taking things personally, and I'm trapped in that cycle of mental noise. But when I journal, I take the thought out of my head and put it on paper. And suddenly it looks different. It's not swirling around inside me anymore. I can see it, work with it, and let it go. That's why I think journaling is such a great tool for clarity, for release, and for breaking free of those mental loops. I think joy is actually contagious. When other people is having joy, it's like, oh, I want to join. It's important to keep your own joy and not to allow the addict to rob you from your own joy. And by keeping your own joy and embracing your own joy and still staying in touch with yourself will help you to stay grounded. But it will also give a vision to the addict of what is possible beyond addiction. When someone is in addiction, they forget the life out of addiction because that addiction actually gives them a sense of joy in that moment. That's many times when they started to become an addict, that addiction gave them something. And now you must show them that you can actually find that something they're looking for out of addiction. And therefore, as a family member, if you keep your joy, it's a nice example. and it can maybe give them hope to conquer the addiction as well.
That's such a good point because I think addicts often will mention too that recovery can be boring. They're used to those extreme highs and extreme lows, and it's getting used to how a normal life actually needs to look. And how do they keep that balance between having the joy and dealing with the pain in life? And they obviously always want to avoid the pain, but showing them that even you as a family member in your pain can find joy can be usually inspirational to them because healing isn't just about being in survival mode the whole time. It's really about remembering how to actually live your life to the fullest.
So we have reached out to some of our listeners, and here are a few recurring questions we want to address. So, John Marie, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I would love to hear some of your advice, some of your wisdom. The first question one of our listeners asked was, how do I set boundaries without pushing my loved one away?
It's such a great question. Boundaries are so important. And I think often we assume people know what our boundaries are, but we really need to communicate what our boundaries are. And it's not about being rigid in your boundaries, but it's also deciding what are some of my non negotiable boundaries that I need to have in place that are really important that I'm not going to compromise on, and where can I be adaptable with some of my boundaries. And we have this perception sometimes that having a boundary or saying no is a punishment, but it's actually not. It's saying, this is what I'm able to offer you, and this is what I can't offer you. It's knowing where I start and end and where you start and end. So you're not shutting the door, but you're keeping everyone in that situation safe.
Your boundaries is so important. The next question I want to ask you is, what if the addict don't want help?
And that's again such a difficult situation to be confronted with because often as the family member, you're desperate to help them. And sometimes they're just not in a place where they're ready to receive that help yet. So again, it's remembering you can't control anyone else and what they choose to do. So it's important that you can stay anchored, that you keep showing up as love without losing yourself in that situation. And sometimes just your calm, steady presence does far more than lecturing them. And they realize that you are there for them, but within your boundaries. And that steady support is not going anywhere.
So let me ask you the final question. What is the biggest mistake you see families make?
I think trying to control the outcome, they need to step back from that idea of trying to fix everything. Maybe they have an idea of recovery should be happening a lot faster than maybe what it is happening. Again, that point of they sometimes see relapse as a failure. It's not, it's part of the process. So focusing on being steady and being present for the person in recovery, but vitally also being compassionate with yourself. So often, again, all the focus is going to the person in addiction. They may be in an inpatient treatment or getting therapy, and everyone's so focused on keeping them clean that the family members just sort of fade into the background. And we need to remember they need just as much support as well. So, coming to the end of our navigation of this journey, it's really important to also say that you're doing better than you think. But remember that healing takes time. So keep showing up, keep learning, and please don't do this alone.
And it's important to remember families can heal and they can grow strong. And sometimes in helping someone else rise, you discover parts of yourself you never knew. There is always hope on the journey.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Surface. Please share this episode if it helped you. You never know who might need it.
And if you haven't already, subscribe. Please do. We'll be back soon with more honest, heartfelt conversations.